Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kemet Podcast, brought to you by the Kemetic Means of Production. I'm your host, Robert Bishara. Today's special guest is Samuel Hayat, a researcher in politics for the French National Center for Scientific Research at the Sciences Po Center for Political Research. He is the author of Revolutionary Republicanism, Participation and Representation in 1848 France, published by Routledge this year. This fantastic book is an English translation from the French original, published in 2014, based on his PhD dissertation 3 years earlier. Welcome, Samuel. And this is what the book looks like.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So first, tell us why you chose the French Revolution of 1848 as your research topic for your first book, and do you see 1848 as more significant than 1792? If so, why?
Thank you. I would not say it's more important, but maybe it's not obvious if you are not French and if you are not been given a French education. You never once in like school and high school and even university, you never hear about this revolution. It is really what it has been called by Michel Rio-Sarcey and Maurizio Gulibaudi, two researchers on 1848, it has been called the forgotten revolution, and it really is. When I discovered the events, I was, I think, doing my master's thesis. I was working on Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, like one of the founders of anarchism in France. And I discovered that most of his texts, especially the most radical ones, were written during this revolution that I had not known about, that is the 1848 revolution. And I then realized that it has been a central moment for Proudhon, but also for Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. It is about 1848 to 1851. It was a pivotal moment, and it was a pivotal moment, especially in the history of French republicanism, because it was for the first time you had universal or so-called universal male suffrage being practiced, and it was the first time. And the result of the revolution was such a catastrophe that it really had a very strong and lasting influence on the idea of the republic in itself and on republicanism in general. So this is why I started working on it, and I thought it would be only part of a larger project. And I finished, focusing for the dissertation and the book on just 4 months, from February, the French Revolution, the insurrection of February 1848, until June 1848, the June days during which thousands of workers were killed by the first National Assembly elected by male universal suffrage in France. So I focused on these 4 months, and I mean, for several years, and I'm still fascinated both by the events and by the fact that no one knows about it, even in France, especially in France.
Yeah, it's such a rich period, and I think you do a fantastic job documenting the history in detail. And what I like the most is that you are obviously defending republicanism, especially in its revolutionary aspects, its potential, but at the same time, you also show the critical aspects of it regarding not just moderate republicanism, but this question of colonization, the inclusion of women, and also working class people outside of Paris, right? So I love this sort of objective analysis of republicanism. So how do you distinguish your perspective on 1848 from Karl Marx's, particularly since the Communist Manifesto was published the same year, obviously reflecting the revolutionary context of class struggle in France, but elsewhere in Europe as well?
I think the main problem with the Marxist interpretation, from my point of view, I mean, it is very immodest to say it this way, but is that the June days, so the workers' insurrection, on June 1848 is analyzed mostly as an episode of a class struggle. So the idea, just for those of you of people listening who maybe do not know about this. So in February 1848, there is an insurrection, and it's mostly made by Parisian workers. There is a very high unemployment then, and workers also did not have access to suffrage. So they kind of had two ideas in mind. First, well, to get so-called universal suffrage, and also to get the right to work, that is the droit du travail, that is, droit au travail, the right to have a job. And the idea that if, because of liberalism or capitalism, we are deprived from a job, it is the duty of the state to give us one. And so the new provisional government that proclaimed the Second Republic, that proclaimed the Republic, they gave universal male suffrage, and they also created these national workshops in which unemployed workers could have a job. And so there was an election on April 1848, the election of a National Constituent Assembly. And this assembly was, represented France in general, but they were face to face with the people of Paris, revolutionary workers. They had weapons. They were members of the National Guard, and the National Assembly wanted to get rid of these workers. And so, after several events, in June, they decided to close the national workshops and to say that every unemployed worker should leave Paris immediately, or it would be sent to the army. And this provoked the insurrection. Now, according to Karl Marx, this insurrection is class struggle at its purest. It is the idea that you have workers, proletarians, who are facing, because of the closing of national workshops, proletarians are facing like death because they do not have a job. And so they decided to rebel. In my opinion, it is only partially true, because when these June insurgents were interrogated after they lost, so many of them were killed, but some were not killed, and they were arrested and interrogated. And the authorities would ask them, why did you do this uprising? Why did you rebel? And their answer was not because we were hungry or because we were desperate. It was because we wanted to defend the Republic. So the idea of the insurgents was that they were the real Republicans, and they thought that the National Assembly, by trying to get rid of them and to make them leave Paris, they wanted to do as they had done in 1830, because there was another revolution in 1830. And this revolution led from one monarchy to another monarchy, a restoration of another monarchy. So they thought, if the National Assembly want to get rid of us, and we are the real Republicans, it means that they want to get rid of Republic altogether. And it means that there is something, let's say, deeply political in the insurrection. It's not just a sort of reaction of some people who are desperate for a job, so they take weapons. Maybe it's true, but mostly it gets rid of the political element. And so by getting rid of these political motivations for the uprising, to me, we do not do justice to their sense of, to the insurgents' normative values and dedication to a cause that is the cause of what they called the social and democratic republic. And in my opinion, there is, something in Marx. So Karl Marx was in Paris at that time, not in June, but he spent 2 months, I think, between March and May 1848, approximately. He was in Paris. He participated, but he was meeting with other revolutionaries, not with the workers. I mean, there were workers in revolutionary clubs, but mostly they were organizing in, trade by trade in their own spheres. So Karl Marx was not in relation with the workers. So he has a very, let's say, he has an interpretation of the events that is a bit remote from the workers themselves. And this could seem paradoxical, but in my opinion, the idea is that if you go and look at what the workers were saying and not revolutionaries, you find political motivation and not only economic and social motivation.
So in a way, you kind of present a more complex picture that doesn't just reduce, because I think the Marxist reading in a sense reduces 1844 as a failed revolution, right? And I think what you're showing is it's not that simple. There are successes, there are failures, and there are things to learn from that moment in history. And it's almost like it reminded me of Agamben a little bit, like the way you're reading potentiality. And so it kind of makes me wonder also, because you mentioned Proudhon, how do you see, perhaps this is an anarchist perspective, and I'm curious about that. How do you see the anarchist connection to republicanism in this case?
Well, Proudhon's interpretation, I mean, is not the only anarchist, but one of the reasons he became such a prominent figure in French socialism, which was not the case back then. Some people knew Proudhon, but it was not like you had many different socialist leaders. You had Louis Blanc, he was even a member of government. You had Etienne Cabet, the founder of Icarian communism that would later lead to many utopian communities in the United States. You had like many different socialist and communist leaders, Pierre Leroux, for example, Victor Considérant, the heir of Charles Fourier, So you had a bunch of socialists, but all of them believed in the capacity for a Republican government to actually transform society from above. Like if you have a political revolution, and the idea is that, yes, we had a political revolution in February 1848, so we just need to give suffrage to everyone, and they would elect, because the workers are the majority, they will elect a socialist assembly, and then from this political revolution, you get a social revolution. And Proudhon is the first one to say from the start, from the beginning, we will lose the elections. That's for sure. And not only will we lose the elections, but actually, even if we win, the state is by nature unable to transform society in the way we socialists want. Because what we want is to give the workers capacity, that is, to empower the workers from below. And to do so, what we need is not for the government to become, to take the place of capitalists. We need the workers to be able to, by themselves, create mechanisms of cooperation based on mutual, let's say, mutual trade without profit. And from that, we will construct socialism. So from below. So he was the only one to say that, and no one to care, It was not, no one paid real attention. Some workers, so he had a newspaper, because hundreds of newspapers were created in
Mm.
February, between February and March 1848. So he had a newspaper called Le Représentant du Peuple, the representative of the people. He was a columnist in the newspaper. And he had these prophecies like, we will lose the elections and the state is unable to reform. And of course, after the failure of the revolution in the June days, uh, people started to pay more attention to him because
Mm.
he was one of the only thinkers who sort of predicted that this would end in a dead end for the socialists to try and use the state. So the anarchist perspective started by Proudhon is that republicanism is not only about the state. Republicanism is about taking the idea of equality and freedom and fraternity and so on and so forth, not only as a basis for organizing the state, but more importantly, a basis for organizing economic relations in the process of production, but also of trade and also of consumption, buying things. Everything should be done in a socialist way, and what they call a socialist way is a republican way. In a way, his interpretation of republicanism, but in that he's not the only one, is to say
Mm.
that real republicanism does not stop at the state. It is something that should transform all relations in society. But even Proudhon was not really thinking it totally
Mm.
and entirely, because, for example, for him, it should stop at the gender barrier. So it
Mm.
was true, but only for men. But in his wake, not only in his wake, but in 1848, you also had like women kind of saying the same thing, saying
Mm.
you want a republic, but if you do not transform the relations
Mm.
between male and female citizens, you do not have a real republic. It's
Mm.
not only a question of enfranchisement, it's not only a question of giving women the right to vote. It is a question of getting rid of the domination of women by men.
Mhm.
So I would say like this is, I'm not saying it's specifically anarchist, but it is really what is revolutionary about republicanism. It's the idea of a transformation of all kinds of relations and all kinds of social experience to make them more republican. What does it mean, more republican? Well,
Mhm.
it means more focused on the common good and more participative in a way. It should
Mhm.
be the result of the participation of all the affected persons.
Mhm. Yes, and you write about associations as kind of the model for that as well. So I thought that was fascinating as an alternative, especially to representative government.
Mm-hmm.
So your book um, is obviously about radical republicanism, which has a revolutionary potential and does not simply boil down to the moderate version of representative government that we're more familiar with today. Talk to us about how democratic republicanism can be revolutionary and what is at stake regarding questions of inclusive representation. I'm seeing you talked about the inclusion of women as political actors, as social actors, but also I think in the book you write about also workers, peasants from rural areas in France, the colonized in Algeria and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So actually, it comes from a political theory question. This problem of representation and what I call inclusive representation. So the idea is that if you are a radical Democrat, if you believe in radical democracy, you should have a sort of not only you should be critical of representation, because representation is you have people talking on your behalf, so talking in your stead. I don't know if you say that in English, but
mhm,
talking and acting and speaking uh, um, where you should be the one who speaks. Okay, so we do not, radical Democrats do not like representation. But my point was to say, if you look at 1848 revolution, actually people were not against representation. They were against representative government
Mm,
and a certain way of representative government to make use of representation. So the idea of representative government is once the representative is elected, once you have the National Assembly and the government, uh, they tell the people to just shut up because we are the representatives. We speak on your behalf, which means that any unauthorized speaking, any unauthorized process done in the name of the people is an usurpation.
mm,
It's not really the people speaking because we are the only one authorized. So I call that exclusionary representation. It means that when the representative speaks, the represented should just disappear. And this is how representative government works. But what revolutionaries are asking in 1848, Democratic Republicans, they are saying they want representatives, but the representatives should act as servants of the people, which means that they are allowed to speak in the name of the people, to speak on behalf of the people, but it means that they always have to obey what the people says. So to have this inclusive representation, it means that the fact that representatives speak as representatives on behalf of the represented should actually trigger direct participation. It should lead to more participation because it should lead to a situation in which the people want to control what is made in their name. Mm?
mm,
And the whole idea of democratic republicans is to say, okay, what kind of structure, what kind of institution can we have that actually uh, um, make this possible? And they had this idea that after February 1848, there were the creation of hundreds of clubs, that is popular societies, in which anyone could participate, even women could participate. And the idea of the club members was to say, you should empower the clubs. You should give them a way to actually be, to actually watch what the representatives do and to be able to pass judgment. So representation in this way can function in two different ways. Exclusionary, it means when the representative speaks, the represented should shut up. And the other ways, inclusive representation is because I am represented, I participate more in politics and not less. And this is like the democratic potential of this form of representation. It is very different from representative government,
mm,
but it's not direct democracy either. No
mm,
one is advocating for direct democracy in 1848. They have no problem having representatives as long as these representatives are under the control of the people. And so it means that the representatives should work in order to help the emancipation, the political emancipation of citizens, to empower them to actually be able to pass judgment. And so, they should let the people have weapons and be
mm,
organized in the National Guard. And from this position, watch what is done by the National Assembly. They should allow them to freely organize in clubs and in newspapers. And they should let the people empower itself, or power themselves, sorry, in order to control what the representatives do.
mm, mm. So how do you see the relationship between democracy and republicanism more generally, and how do you read the way these signifiers are co-opted and distorted by the two major parties in the US, in US politics today? For most Americans, republicanism implies conservatism, for
Mm-mm.
instance. So if I say I'm a Republican in the US, you know how it sounds. So Talk to us about that relationship and how it gets filtered into US politics.
Well, this is interesting because when we deal with words, we deal with weapons, that can be appropriated by different political groups and social groups, and they use them in different ways. And sometimes some win, some groups win and they manage to actually say, well, we are Republicans. So, of course, it is obvious in the case of the US, but now in France, the party called Les Républicains, the Republicans, is also the right-wing party.
Mm,
So why is it just a total misunderstanding of the Republic? I don't think so. There are
mm,
elements in republicanism since its, let's say, second coming in you know in Italian city-states in the 13th century, and then its development in, let's say, in Venice, in Florence, and then in the UK, and then in the US, and then in France, and in many other parts of the world, of course. This idea of republicanism, of the republic, is that the general interest should always prevail, and the way the general interest prevails is by making sure people are virtuous, they have virtue, which means that they are dedicated to the common good. And of course, it goes with many, let's say, aristocratic elements, because if the common good should prevail, then who says what the common good is? Usually, it is the people who have the most knowledge and the most virtue that are the most dedicated to the public. And of course, it's very easy to say to workers that want more money, or to women who want to become enfranchised, or to former slaves in the colonies who want their independence and full citizenship. It's easy to say, well, you are just defending your interest. You should defend the general interest.
mm,
So there is something that is aristocratic and elitist about republicanism. Now, democracy is something a bit different, because the idea is, the core is to give power not to the general good, but to the demos.
mm,
The demos is the people, and the people always have two meanings. It can mean all citizens, and it can mean the plebs. It can mean
mm,
the small people. It can mean
mm,
the workers.
mm,
If you read like Plato and Aristotle, they describe democracy as the rule of the poor, because they are the majority and because they are the demos. The demos is the poor. So there is something more, let's say, plebeian about democracy, which makes it easier, in my opinion, to allow for a sort of left-wing interpretation of what democracy is, which is not the general interest, but the interest of the demos,
mm,
and not necessarily the interest as it is interpreted from like knowledge, people who have knowledge, but the will of the people,
mm,
demos kratos, the will of the people, in a way that is more, let's say, um, interested in making the people decide, and the
mm,
people being like the poor people. So you could say, okay, so republicanism is more right wing and more conservative, and Democrats, it's more open to the idea of equality, to the idea of empowering the people as the plebs. But as it happens, it depends from time to time,
mm,
because if you listen if you take the vocabulary in France in the 1830s and 1840s, democracy was seen as something, a form of equality in society itself, but it did not require um, uh, to get rid of the monarch, to get rid of the monarchy.
mm,
So you could say that you were a Democrat, but you were in favor of monarchy. If you look at Alexis de Tocqueville, that
Mm,
very famously went to the United States and he wrote his two books on democracy in America. What he means by democracy is not the power of the people
mm,
in politics. It is about social equality. What he sees or what he thinks he sees is the progress of the idea of a statutory equality in the United States. And he was in favor of monarchy. He was
mm,
actually a representative in France during the July monarchy, and then during the Second Republic. He was a defender of constitutional monarchy, and
mm,
he could say that he believed in democracy. So it depends on the situation. In France, the idea in 1848 was that being a Republican before the revolution of 1848, because being a Republican was the most radical, because
mm,
it was forbidden by law. You could not say you were a Republican after. Uh, uh, I'm not boring you with details, but I don't want to bore you with details. But after 1834, it had become illegal to call for a republic and to call
mm,
yourself a Republican. But you could call yourself a Democrat. So to say you were a Republican was more radical.
mm,
But then, when the Republic had become a reality in 1848, everybody had become a Republican. So you need to say that you were a democratic Republican
mm,
to mean that you were actually in favor of social equality, in addition to political power to the people. That's what was thought about republic. So, and it all depends, I
mm,
think, on the context and the situation. There is something, there is always an aristocratic connotation to republicanism, that's
mm,
for sure. But democracy does not rely as much as republicanism on popular participation, because it is more about a state of society, an equal state of society. So depending on the situation, being
mm,
a Democrat usually is more on the left, it's more egalitarian, but it's not necessarily as participative and
mm,
as politically empowering than republicanism is. But of
mm,
course, when you start to have political parties and they successfully manage to monopolize the idea of Republicans and Democrats,
mm.
then of course it changes the whole way you think about it.
Right. It's just the way like libertarian means anarchist
Yeah,
in most of the world, but in the US it means that
yeah,
hyper capitalist, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I like also this idea that there's some kind of aristocratic essence to republicanism because it seems like republicanism being a response, a dialectical response to monarchy, somehow retains a little bit of that as it's responding to it and critiquing it.
Mm, mm,
So
mm,
that's fascinating to think about. So tell us
mm.
about Hannah Arendt's view on republicanism and her distinction between freedom and liberation, which is something that you explore. It's kind of like a theme.
Yeah, it's always, I mean, it's her book on revolution, which is problematic by many means, because she doesn't really believe in social revolution, whereas I I am a true believer in the necessity for a social revolution and not just a political revolution. But there is something that is very important, I think, to understand, is that for her, liberty, like freedom, sorry, the real work of freedom that happens in a revolution is not about liberation. It's about uh, uh, not only getting rid of your chains, it's about starting something. It is about being able to create a new beginning in a way.
Mm,
And this is something that is for me very important, because it is linked with the idea that during a revolution, people develop a sense of their own importance. They matter. They matter because they are founding something. And it is something that is uh, very important, in my opinion, to make people believe in revolution again, in a way,
Mm,
because it's not only about, you will have a better situation after a revolution. It's about the idea that you should, we should collectively enjoy this extraordinary freedom to be at the beginning of something new, of
mm,
something better, of something more, that something that has never been done in humanity. This kind of idea. And if you take the French Yellow Vest movement, it
mm,
seems that it has nothing to do, because it was not a success. It did not lead to a revolution, but there was a very important sense of doing something that was absolutely new,
mm,
and opening a new era for France that would become a real democracy or something like that. And for me, it is important because it is existentially important
mm,
for us to, yeah, to be able to create something new. It's a very specific sense of political dignity to
mm,
say that, you know history can remember us as a generation that has founded uh, um, a new regime, or has founded something that would last for a certain period of time.
mhm. It sounds like liberation, in liberation, you're against something. You're trying to destroy, let's say, monarchy, but in freedom, you are for something. You're trying to build a new institution, new way of organizing society, right?
Yeah, but of course the two go together. I mean, if
Mm-hmm,
you, so once again, Proudhon, his system of economic contradiction starts with this Latin phrase. I don't remember the sentence exactly, but it is distracting and edificating. You
mm, mm,
cannot create something new if you don't get rid of what prevents you from
mm-hmm,
creating something new. And often it is in the process of destructing the old that you can build the new, of course. But the idea is that if you want to understand what a revolution is about, according to Arendt, you need to see what kind of imagination is at play. And it is linked with something that is developed, for example, by Cornelius Castoriadis, a Greek,
mm-hmm,
a French radical Democrat from Greek origins, who talks about this radical imagination. You
mm,
need to have some sort of a collective radical imagination in a real democracy,
mm,
because if you are in a situation in which you just deal with the institutions that exist, you do not fully live
mm,
the democratic ideal, I think.
mm. Yeah, this question of possibility and potential is at the heart of your book. And actually, the first quote that you have in the book, the Republic of 1792 destroyed the old order. The Republic of 1848 must constitute the new order. So in a sense, I feel like that's liberation and freedom, if
Yeah,
it's
in a
captured
way,
in a captured in a quote. Yeah.
it
Um.
is a sort of it is sorry, it's something that is very often, you find very often in texts by socialists in the 1830s, 1840s in France, the idea that the French Revolution, so the 1789 French Revolution, was very successful in destroying the existing society, the old order, like feudalism and the monarchy, but stopped short. They did not continue their revolutionary work. They did not found something new. And this is the task of socialism to do so. Socialism is a word that started to be used in the 1830s, 1840s. And they really have this idea that socialism is about foundation, is about founding something, a new society based on equality
Mhm.
and based on the emancipation of the poorest class, that is the proletariat, which is another word that started to be used at that time.
Mhm. So in your account of 1848, you document the political forces that shaped the February Republic, the Provisional Government, the National Guard, the Luxembourg Commission, and the Club Movement. Although these forces were not always aligned politically, they produced what you call a plural system, at least for a period of time. Why do you think this plural or complex system was not politically sustainable in the long run, and how can we create plural political systems today that are both liberatory and freeing?
This is this is a complicated question because
Mm,
we do not know. At some point, there is always, it seems to me, that there is always one institution that prevails. But what is interesting in 1848 is that, okay, they have an insurrection, they have a revolution, they have a republic, but no one knows what a republic is.
mm,
And or they have too many examples in the past. Like if you take the French Revolution of 1789, from 1789 to the end of a century, you have like maybe four constitutions and many
mm,
different forms of republic, from the reign of terror, a Jacobin reign of terror, to very liberal democracy with no popular participation. So what is a republic? They do not really know. They want to
mm,
found a republic, but they don't know what it is.
mm,
And in this situation, you have a proliferation of speeches in the name of the people. And you have the crystallization of different institutions in which they can make a claim, what is called by Mike Sayward a representative claim. They can say, we are the real representatives of the people. So you have the provisional government
mm,
that was appointed in February 1848. They say we represent the people, but no one has elected them.
mm,
They were just sort self-proclaimed. Okay,
mm,
you have the National Guard. The National Guard is composed of citizens bearing arms, and they elect their leaders, and they have successfully monopolized uh, police power inside of Paris and inside of the big cities, and they claim to speak in the name of the people. You have then this very peculiar institution called the Luxembourg Commission.
mm,
It is an assembly of workers. To my knowledge, it is the first assembly of workers in the history of humankind. You know,
mm,
it is, and they sit in the Senate, in the
mm,
Chamber of Peers, in the highest
mm,
uh, chamber. You know, and they are elected by trade. Every trade has sent like three people. They have elected three workers to represent the shoemakers, the bakers, and so on and so forth. And they sit in the Senate and they claim to speak in the name of the people. And then you have all these clubs and all this revolutionary press, and they start to federate, you know, to create associations of clubs, to create this voice of the people, and they claim to be the voice of the people. So you have these different institutions, and each of these institutions, they have their own internal conflict
mm,
about what kind of policy should be done. So you sort of have partisan lines between moderate Republicans and democratic Republicans. You can find these lines in these dividing lines in every institution,
mm,
and it creates a system that is a bit chaotic, but that has one merit, is that since no one has the prevailing authority, um, their conflict is always subject to popular participation. They need, when they enter in a conflict of legitimacy, they have to prove that their claim is more valid because they can mobilize citizens. And so during the spring of 1848, you have the invention in France of what we call demonstration,
mm,
manifestation. It was the first time you had this popular mass protests with no uh, insurrectional intention, just protesting, just to say, I support the provisional government, or I support the club's members, or I support the Luxembourg Commission against the attempts to delegitimize them, and so on and so forth. So
mm,
you sort of have to resort to the people, and it creates this system of pluralism, but it's not, let's say, liberal pluralism. It is
mm,
a form of democratic pluralism because you need the people to actually be the arbiter of all the debates
mm,
between institutions that claim to speak on its behalf.
mm,
But of course, once you have the National Assembly elected, the question is, can it continue? Because the
mm,
National Assembly can claim to have a more valid representative claim because
mm,
they were elected by the whole of France. So they can say we are the only we are the only ones representing the sovereign. Once we sit, no one else could claim to speak on behalf of the people. We are the only representatives of the people.
mm,
And of course, this claim, we of course for us it's obvious. Yes, when you have an assembly, it is representative. What you have seen in the US on January the 6th is
mm,
that when people do not accept that an assembly
mhm,
is representatives, it leads to factious and to a very dangerous idea.
mm,
But in 1848, maybe it was a bit dangerous also, but what is for sure is that the political uh, motivations of the Parisian people was to make their own claim to represent the people seen as valid. And
mm,
so in May the 15th, 1848, they invaded the assembly, not to replace representatives,
mm,
but to make sure that they would vote the good way, that
mm,
they would vote, in that case, a plan to go help Poland because there
mm,
was an insurrection in Poland and they were suffering repression. And so the demonstrators, they wanted to force the assembly to 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 um, to go and help Poland. So for me, what is important is that before the assembly was elected, since no institution could claim to have the definite to be the only representative of the French people, it led to this situation in which you had to resort to popular participation. But of
mm,
course, it is not it is not satisfactory. When I say that, I'm not saying this is what we should imitate, because
mm,
actually this was tested
mm,
in certain ways. It is part, especially if you look at the Cultural Revolution in Maoist China,
mm,
you have elements of that. And what we see is that this appeal to constant popular participation is emancipatory, all right, but it's also creating chaos, and
mm,
it leaves the people open to manipulation. Like the Red Guards in
mm,
the Cultural Revolution in China, maybe they were real revolutionaries, but behind the scenes, you had an autocrat, Mao, just deciding
mm,
what should actually be done. So yeah, I'm not saying it's a good system. I'm
mm,
saying we have to think about, we know what we know what we gain when we have institutional stability, and when one institution represents the people, we know that we have more stability. We know that we have a more liberal system, but
mm,
we lose the need for popular participation.
mm,
Whereas when no institution can have the definite say, when you have to resort to the people in case of conflict between institutions, well, you have a more democratic society. So for me, the challenge is to design institutions
mm,
that make it so no institution has sovereignty,
mm,
but also you have institutional mechanisms. It's not just chaos. It's not just like
right.
anyone against everyone, but institutions to make the people directly decide in case of institutional conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you are against populism, right? Which,
It depends.
yeah. Okay.
It depends what you call populism, because you have populist republicanism, right? Like,
Mm,
if you look, so for example, John McCormick, he's a specialist of Machiavel, and he is saying that Machiavel is a populist Republican.
mm,
And you have another political theorist, Camila Vergara.
mm,
She works on populist republicanism. She's saying, republicanism, because it has aristocratic tendencies, you need populist tendencies.
mm, mm,
And these populist tendencies is the idea of making popular judgment a real thing,
mm,
making popular judgment actually empowered. And the question of Camila Vergara is, how do you empower this sort of uh, plebeian
mm.
populist function of the people? So I'm not against
Okay.
that. I'm saying that maybe it's not, uh, uh, maybe we have to create institutions that uh, sort of maintain this uncertainty,
Mm,
that
mm, mm.
maintain this pluralism in a way.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I was thinking specifically of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe and, their project of radical democracy and how they talk about populism. So,
yeah. No, I'm very much. I mean, it's always a question of, you always focus on the differences
mm,
with the closest friends. Like,
right.
I feel very close from
Mm,
Laclau and Mouffe's perspective in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, their
mm,
1985 book. I'm very much in favor of that. The
mm,
problem is when you have a political party
mm,
that claims to represent, and
mm,
to not only represent, to really embody the
mm,
people.
mm,
This is like the populist solution to have this party. And I'm saying maybe it's interesting, but let's not forget about Proudhon. Let's not forget about the idea that a real radical democracy, or a real popular revolutionary republicanism, is not only about the state. It's not
mm,
only about having a party that can get the hegemony and
mm,
conquer power. It is also about transforming all all social relations.
mm,
And transforming all social relations is not something that a party can do.
mm,
It is something historically that was that is maybe more aligned with what revolutionary syndicalism would do.
mm,
Like, the more radical trade unions, in the United States, the IWW
mm,
kind of syndicalism that is transformative. It's
mm,
not just, dealing with having representatives to negotiate. It's about imagining, it's about struggling, and in the struggle, imagining a different future,
mm,
imagining founding something different. So yeah, I'm not against populism, but for me, populism is one element
okay.
in a radical strategy. You need populism, you need revolutionary syndicalism, you need radical feminism, you need all sort of anti-racist movement. You need many
Mm,
different things.
right.
And the problem with populism is that they want the populist party to
Mm,
be the one coordinating
yeah.
everything. And
Monopoly, like a case of monopoly, and also oversimplifying politics. Like
yeah,
the way I see you reading republicanism, it's like at its best, it's a complex system. It's managing the complexity of society itself and stabilizing that complexity through democratic institutions.
yeah, this is the most important element, is the last one, is you can have complexity that is, managed in a liberal way
Mm,
through juridical relations. And I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not democratic.
mm,
What matters is to have this plurality, this complexity of institutions in which the people, in all the generality of the term, but also the people as the plebs, as the dominated, are at the center at all time. And you need to have institutions in which you cannot do without the people. Because if you have institutions in which you can do without the people, it's guaranteed that it
mm,
will be sooner or later, things are going to be done without the people because
mm,
it's more convenient for people in power, you know?
mm, mm. And it's not sustainable, I think, long term, because
Mm,
ultimately the people revolt if they don't see themselves represented.
mm,
So my next question is kind of a personal one and a little bit complex, speaking of complexity. So your erudite historical account comes across as a history of the present. Given that I am Egyptian, I could not help but think of the Egyptian uprising in 2011 while reading your book, particularly analyzing the competing political forces in the arena at the time. So I was thinking of the army or the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, and everyone else associated with his National Democratic Party, the police, Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis, the revolutionaries on the streets, neoliberal types such as Naguib Sawiris, and secular political figures such as Muhammad al-Baradei, some of whom would later on establish the National Salvation Front, like Amr Musa and Hamdin Sabahi. So let's consider like the period between January 25th, 2011 and the 2013 coup d'etat on July 3rd. So we witnessed some successes like the end of Mubarak's reign, the dissolution of his party, the defeat of the police, the first democratic elections in the country's history, but this democracy lasted for 1 year. We also see the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood, the defeat of secular and civic society, and the ideological cooptation of the revolutionaries through the slogan, "The army and the people are one hand."
mm.
Uh, so I'd love to hear your analysis of this revolutionary period and how can we reflect on the radical potential of republicanism in Egypt, which has been dominated by the military since 1952. Like help us think through this through the lens of 1848. What can we learn today?
Actually, it's striking that in the wake of the Tunisian and
Mm,
then Egyptian revolution and Syrian revolution, a lot of people uh, made a comparison with the Spring of the People. The Spring of the People is what happened after the French uprising of 1848. The whole continent, every country in Europe except the UK, knew a revolution. And it was not just Europe, because you had the Caribbean revolutions, of course, with uprisings in the French colonies that would lead to many to many insurrections in the region and so on and so forth. So there was a spring of the people. And then when people started to speak about the Arab Spring, you started to have this sort of resemblance. I think, I don't remember the name, but one colleague wrote an article about this parallel between
mm,
the Spring of the People and the so-called Arab Spring. And it is clear if you take especially the Tunisian and the Egyptian examples, that you have striking resemblance with the event, not only in France, but in many situations with a movement of revolution and then
mm,
reactionary movement. In the Tunisian case, it took 10 years for the situations to lead to what it is now, that is a dictatorship.
mm,
But it's a dictatorship in the name of the Tunisian revolution. So
mm,
it's a bit complicated. It's a sort of populist dictatorship without a populist party. The reign of Kais Saied is very
mm,
particular. If you take the Egyptian case, in a way, it was very different from France because in the
mm,
French case, so in February, you have a revolution in 1848. February Revolution, the June Uprising, so reactionary movement. And then in December, you have an election, and it is Bonaparte who is elected, the
mm,
first president in the history of France, elected by a very large margin in the first round of election. But in the case of Egypt, the leader that was elected was overthrown very quickly by the army. That is Mossi, right?
Morsia.
Yeah, was so it's very different from the French situation, because you could say the elected leader. So in the case of France in 1848, the elected leader remained in power. In Egypt, the leader was overthrown, but it was not overthrown by the army. It was overthrown by a popular revolution that led to the army getting back in power and restoring the Mubarak regime with Al-Sisi in many ways. So every situation is different. What is for sure is that we see that the people, whether it is by an insurrection or by an election, is never a guarantee for democracy, which is a bit paradoxical or contradictory with what I was saying we need a pluralistic system in which the people can be the arbiter. But so it can seem paradoxical to say, you know what, in Egypt, the people voted for the wrong guy, and then the people overthrew this guy. And so it's no guarantee at all, either in the election or in the streets, for a democratic thing. But for me, the problem is not the participation of the people, is the competition for sovereignty, for having a supreme power. If you have a supreme power, a presidential power, it doesn't matter if it is, well, it matters, but it can be Morsi, it can be Al-Sisi, it can be Mubarak. The problem is the unitary conception of the state, in which, okay, the people decide, but the people decide who is the dictator in a way. And this can never lead to a situation that is the democratic situation, in my opinion. So, of course, there are, but you are right, there are striking resemblances between the situations. The only thing I can say on that is that history does not really teach us lessons, because when I was on a personal note, I'm from Tunisian origins. So when there was the revolution in Tunisia in January 2011, the first thing I did was to go to Tunisia. I took the first plane I could, and I arrived in Tunisia. It was still a revolutionary moment. It was a few days after the revolution. And I stayed like a month there. And I was at that time finishing writing my PhD dissertation on 1848. So in a way, I was observing a revolution, and at the same time, I was writing about another one. And the truth is, I had nothing, I had no lesson to give. I didn't know. What I saw was contradictory movements in which different factions try to instrumentalize, to use the people in their own, to foster their own agenda. And, I didn't know what to say to comrades and friends, saying, okay, but what should be done, and so on and so forth. Because the problem is, a revolution is the creation of something new. And in every situation, you have forces that want to get rid of this, let's say, popular imagination and this popular potentiality for creation. And, the people does not have a lot of real friends, many false friends who want to, to benefit from their participation, but just for their own agenda. And I think in Egypt, that was a case in point. You had the army, you had the Muslim Brotherhood, and in the end, the people who got jailed and killed were the revolutionaries. They had they had lost, and it is because the institution was as in always, was so state-centered. What
Yeah.
if you have this state power, I mean, it is very complicated, in my opinion, to have a successful popular revolution in the
Mm.
long run.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is like I would love to see a historical analysis of, let's say, the Egyptian uprising, similar to what you did with 1848, but I guess
Yeah.
that requires some distance to really do a good analysis. But also, I think the problem in Egypt is that the army is seen historically as a revolutionary force because of
Yeah.
1952. And so, um, even when the people defeated the police and Mubarak's regime, they still unconsciously thought the army is a revolutionary force. Now, the question I guess that I have, because in 2013, the people, you know, protested on the streets, not only against Morsi, but in a sense, I feel like the Egyptian people rejected democracy as a whole. And that's why, the coup succeeded. And how does, like, how could this change over time for a country like Egypt or Tunisia to have like civic republicanism, democratic republicanism? Is that possible? That's what I'm curious about.
I think that civic republicanism and this sort of preference for democracy, let's say, is something that is never guaranteed. Like there is no country in which I could say with confidence,
Mm,
like, okay, they are real Democrats. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that democracy is something that you have to practice. And if it is just about voting and about
mm,
having a good institutional design, it is just not enough,
mm,
because practicing democracy is about practicing this new beginnings thing. It's about revolution in a way. It doesn't mean
mm,
to be a big revolution over time, but like you need practice. And what is very difficult is that, of course, in the Tunisian or Egyptian case, they had practice. They were in a revolution.
mm,
So it's not a question of a lack of civic engagement or of a lack of civic culture.
mm,
Is that they were facing forces that did not it's not that they did not have a democratic culture, is that they were and still are against democracy
mm.
at their core. I'm not saying, I don't know about Morsi. Was he a dictator or not? I don't know. I don't know
I
in
think the
what
thing
state.
that pissed people off is in December of 2012, he pretty much increased his power
Yeah,
constitutionally, and that's why basically it led to June, what happened on June. Yeah.
exactly. So he was in the process, like Putin today, of uh, making sure that once he had been elected, that he would be able to to have his own agenda and to remain in power and so on and so forth. So the problem is, even when you have a democratic people with civic culture and civic republicanism, the people at the head of the state
Mm,
do not share this democratic culture. And this is not a problem of Tunisia or Egypt. This is the
yeah.
case in every country. The difference, because it is the case of all leaders, there
Mm,
are no democratic leaders. You can have democratic leaders in certain situations in a process. I mean, I would never dare to say that Nelson Mandela was not a democratic leader,
mm,
or Gandhi. But it's the problem of the crystallization of power. At
mm.
some point, even if you come from a radical movement, when you arrive in power, you have this
Right.
sort of authoritarian tendencies that
There's
are
narcissism involved
built.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have these psychological elements, but you also have, like, the state is structured like that.
Mm,
Our states, they all come from monarchies. They all
mm,
come from authoritarian states. We have not created a new thing, a new
mm,
way of understanding the relation between government, police, lawmaking,
mm,
and a citizenship, we
mm,
still inherit this
mm,
from authoritarian situations. So people inside these institutions,
mm,
they develop authoritarian tendencies because the institutions are themselves authoritarian in a way.
mm, mm,
So the problem is the people. So what makes the difference between a democracy today, like the United States, and a post-revolutionary situation in Egypt and Tunisia? I don't think it's the democratic culture or the civic culture. It is the constitutional guarantees. It is the
mm,
fact that you have a very strong administrative and legal system that is stabilized and that prevents, in the best cases, the best scenarios, prevent the most authoritarian tendencies
mm,
of politicians and of leaders. So it's this system, but it's not democratic, right?
mm,
It's not because it relies on institutions, on legal institutions that
mm,
prevent authoritarianism, but to
mm,
do so, they do not need the people.
mm,
They do not need people participating. They don't resort on people participation.
mm,
So
mm,
it seems that today we either have authoritarian regimes or authoritarian regimes that are a bit uh, 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 controlled by a non-democratic legal system. You don't have
mm,
a democracy. You have differently organized authoritarian system. And
mm,
of course, I'm not saying that everything is the same. I'm very happy to live in a system in which the authoritarian tendencies of the government
mm,
are limited by the law. I
mm,
really like that. But I'm not saying it's a democratic way of reducing authoritarianism. It
mm,
is a liberal way of reducing authoritarianism, but it is not democratic.
mm. No, it's fascinating. I love what you said too about the shadow or the ghost of monarchy in the form of the state, whether, the kind of, we haven't invented really a non-hierarchical state structure, if that's even possible. So finally, I want to ask you what you're working on now. What is your next book project?
Well, right now I'm working on anti-politics because it seems to me that we do not really give credit to the people. I mean, people hate politics, right?
Mm,
If you are not a political scientist or if you are not yourself an activist, people hate politics in general. They think that political is bad, you know?
mm, mm,
And I do political science. When I say to people I do political science, there's a sort of, oh, okay, so it's not good. It's
mm,
you don't like politics. And usually we have a tendency to think that it's because people are dumb, because of course politics is important and
mm,
politicization is important and depoliticization is the worst thing that can happen, you know.
mm,
So, and I believe in that. I believe that politics is important, but I want to take seriously the arguments of people who do not like politics.
mm,
And to do so, I try to do a sort of history of political thought things, like trying
mm,
to see what reasons were given by many authors, especially authors that are radical Democrats in the
mm,
past. What do they have against politics? And so I read like obscure
mm,
one priest from the 17th century, an atheist priest called Jean Méliès, and
mm,
he has this idea that the power is corrupting everyone, and we should not have political power, and so on and so forth. So I try to do a history of popular anti-politics,
mm,
of the reasons why people can hate politics and have good reasons to do so. And my
mm,
idea is not to defend them. My idea is to say, well, if it's been 2,000 years that people hate politics, maybe we should listen to the reason they have to hate politics in
mm.
order maybe to defend politics. But we need to get their, yeah, their idea. So this is the project I'm working on
No,
right now.
that's absolutely fascinating. I look forward to that book, and thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining me today. I learned a lot from your book, and I'm very inspired by it.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the great conversation. And sorry, because as you have heard, my English is not always like on point, but
No, it's great.
I'm very happy to have had this opportunity to discuss with you. So thanks a lot.